Welcome to Going In Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell, and my guest today is the human swan. She's an adventurer, a freediver, a conservationist, and founder of Conservation Without Borders. But she was also the first woman to undertake a 7,000-kilometer motorized paraglider trip, ride, I guess excursion, whatever you want to call it, following swans across their migratory path from Russia to the UK. And for my fellow Americans and people that aren't on the metric system, it's like almost 5,000 miles. It's like 48, or no, I think 4,350 miles, which is, the United States is only like 2,800 miles wide. So that is freaking crazy. And I'm sure we're going to get all sorts of cool stories out of her today. But before we do, just a couple quick announcements as usual. If you've been listening for a while and want to be kept up to date with what I'm up to and the two big projects that I have going on behind the scenes right now, head over to my website at zachtidwell.com and you can sign up for the mailing list there. It's not a spam list. You'll just get announcements and early deals for things as those projects do come out. And also, if you're new to the show, head over there and read a little bit about me so you can see kind of the driving force behind this podcast and what's going on and what I do. But I think that's about everything I needed to touch on. So without any further ado, Sacha Dench, hello.
Hello, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a minute since we connected. So I've been dying to ask you all sorts of stuff. And I feel like this is probably a new iteration of the age-old question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. But what came first, the genetics or the turtle rodeo?
How did you dig up turtle rodeo? Uh, the genetics definitely turned up first. I was a proper nerd. I've always been into kind of maths and statistics and things, and actually genetics is a lot about that. It's about it's one of the areas where maths and statistics has a lot of power. You get a few pieces of data and you can extrapolate quite a lot from that. However, there was definitely a point in my degree, which I was doing in London, where we were looking at, where do you want to do your future research? And from a London-based student at UCL, there are various different academics who've got files or freezers full of samples of different things. And my supervisors at the time were desperate for me to work on either some snail samples, or I think somebody else had a collection of tropical fish, but all the samples were already taken, so they had samples in a freezer. And the other offer I had was to go out to the Great Barrier Reef and work with the University of Queensland and a fantastic woman, actually start from scratch where we were getting our own data. And yeah, so actually the appeal of going out and figuring out how to get samples from turtles, particularly from male turtles that never come on shore, that was definitely appealing. And not appealing to most people, but I think I'd already had my passion for freediving then. So for my supervisor, she needed to find someone who was interested in the work and the data, but was also happy to jump off a speedboat in pursuit of turtles.
Yeah, I bet they weren't very happy about getting wrangled up either. But like the turtles. So
Not no, not for the moment that we were there. No, probably not.
I
No,
want.
particularly as they were particularly easy to grab if they were in the middle of mating, but we had to avoid that because obviously you don't want to mess with their breeding specifically. But that would have been really easy if you get them while they were floating on the surface. But no, we had to get them in mid swim.
Yeah, that would have been just kind of, I feel like uncalled for to interrupt that. That's a little rude. I feel like you're all, it's
I
already a
mean, it
little
goes on for a
invasive.
very, very, very long time. And if you're a female watching it, he's generally biting either the back of her fins or the back of her neck so hard.
Oh,
He's pulling off bits of flesh that I
cheeky
can't see
turtle.
felt. Well, this is how they do it. They're pretty tough.
That's
So you see,
crazy.
but it felt like you could just kind of hang around. If they wouldn't mind, you could hang around behind him and like bits, like he'll bite bits off her. Surely we could grab a piece of that accidentally. That is.
Wow.
But yeah, yeah.
Is
I've never shared that story before. Ever.
is it at?
How are you starting off a podcast like this?
Yeah, this is new territory for me, but that's kind of the I've so I won't spend too much time digging into this, but is it at what you would expect turtle speed to be?
I don't really know what's going on. All you see, I mean, they might be attached to each other. Well, he'll be gripping onto her for it could be an hour. It's a very, very
Oh my
long
God.
surface. And yeah, God knows what's going on, what the intricacies are. That was never a part of my genetics work. But once they release and he's on the move, they can actually go much faster than you think.
Huh.
And they're quite nimble in the water, whilst the females, when they're on land, they look kind of very sluggish and everything. But underwater, a large turtle, particularly the loggerhead which I was working on, are very nimble.
How big-ish or so are they?
Loggerhead, oh gosh, I've not really thought about it for a while. Maybe a meter and a half kind of long. Would that be possible?
Okay.
Just imagine if you. So one of the methods of catching them was to hang on the side of the speedboat, and the driver would kind of go alongside them. They are moving, so you have to throw yourself off and dive into the water and try to catch them. So that your for me it would be my right hand would be grabbing the back of their carapace just behind their head,
Hmm.
and with the left hand you reach down and grab the rear end of the shell. And so once you're in that position, they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop finning for into the distance. So what you have to do is force their bottom end down. But if in terms of size, if you imagine that my arms spread out, were I could put my arms around a full adult male, but it was a stretch.
Okay. That is so
So imagine,
crazy.
yes, your fingertip to fingertip curved around a shell would be a big male loggerhead turtle.
Gosh, how long were you doing all that?
So the research trips only are throughout the breeding season. So at a time that would only be for a few weeks. Uh,
Okay.
so yeah, a few intense weeks where you've got to figure it out very quickly. And if you slip when you dive in, if you yeah, you have to get pretty good at judging not only the angle that you dive and everything else, because if you miss with your hands, you're trying to dive on top of them and grab the front of the carapace. But if you miss and they're slippery, if they've been hanging out in shallow waters for a while, they'll have quite a lot of algae growing on their shells because they'll be close to the sunshine where algae can grow, and they're quite slippery. So if your one hand slips and you got too much momentum, you can like crack your nose on the back of the on the
Oh,
back of a shell. Uh,
jeez.
so there are, and you don't want to get your fingers within the front, in front of their face at all, because they have got the capability to bite a finger off without thinking about it. So yeah. Anyway, it was only a few weeks at a time for the season that we had to get as many DNA samples as possible.
Did you get to stay down there and see the hatching and the like Normandy beach landing in reverse from all the little
Yeah.
turtles run into the sea?
I have seen it there, but that happens a bit later after during
Yeah.
the breeding season. Their incubation is for a while, but yeah, I've seen that in various parts of the world. I went on to do turtle research in different places. Yeah, it's a pretty epic moment watching a. I don't know. Have you experienced a turtle hatching before?
No, not in person. It's like it's something obviously now that I can't see, I wouldn't get much out of being there for it. But like when I could see, I don't know, I would have loved to have seen. And
There are,
yeah.
you might get, there could be, up to 100, maybe a few more little ones if they all make it out there. I don't know. There'd be quite a lot audibly. There's a lot of sound movement, and then all these little creatures moving down to the water. And that bit is quite epic, but depending on where you are. Well, so beaches of Suriname, I spent a season on beaches on the north coast of Suriname, on the north coast of South America.
Hmm.
And in the wilds there would be, of all these little babies, there's a great moment where they're all heading for the shore, but there's so much other wildlife around, and this is easy picking. So
Yeah.
there will be birds there, there'll be jaguars there, and as soon as they hit the water, there'll be massive splashes of water because there are big fish that are waiting, going.
Jeez. That's such a
Great
hard
work.
life.
With working on turtles, you cannot get emotionally connected to your subjects, not when they're little at all. So yeah,
Yeah, it makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, it shows you that life is tough, but they've been around for a very long time, so they're doing something right.
Yeah. How did you get into free diving?
Hmm. So as a kid, I have always known that I could hold my breath longer than all my friends in the pool, long enough to scare my parents. And
Okay.
yeah, kids can be cruel. They love weird ideas. Yeah. But so I mean, it was partly both my parents were scuba divers, and part of the European scuba training involved having to do a bit of holding your breath, like sorting out masks and things like that. Things like that. They both knew that they had good breath holds amongst them. So I've always known that, and I also grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney, with both parents being interested in being in the sea. My dad used the idea of babysitting used to be to kind of have me sitting on the rock pools exploring the rock ledges, and just off the edge of that is the sea, and so he'd be spearfishing along the coast. So I basically got very, very comfortable with the sea and being underwater. Knew I was, yeah, I could maybe that was a talent when I was dreadful at hand-eye coordination and most of the things that are traditional sports. But it wasn't until I was in London during my university study, and I was standing on the steps of there's a church called St Martin in the Fields, which is at one the north end of it. Anyway, looking out over the square, taking a photograph, and I stepped backwards and I knocked a guy over. And out of his bag spilled all over the place, and out of his bag spilled a load of photographs of people underwater. And I instantly looked at them and I was like, wow, what is this? Forget the fact that I've just knocked you over. He had just been on a down to photograph people doing a freediving course in Plymouth Harbour, which is off the south coast. At that time, it was still pretty well. It's the old military base, so an old naval. I think it's a naval base. Lots of people have done their commercial dive training there. I'd done my scuba diving training at university there. It was very polluted still at the time, so raw sewage was going straight out into there. Oh, yeah, it was a pretty grim place to go, but it made you tough. Like, let's say there's things that yeah, it's quite good, I think, to train in the worst possible circumstances, and that might have been getting close. But anyway, um, so I knocked this guy over, and he'd just been on a freediving course off the coast, so maybe a couple of kilometers out. And I instantly had a bit of like a light bulb moment of going, what, a course? And he said, yeah, there's whole competitions. And I went, got competitions in holding your breath and like diving underwater. And I don't know how it had missed me all this time, but I at that point I called up the instructor, and I'd said to him I wasn't really interested in the competition at all because I'd never been any good at anything that was kind of considered competitive sport. But there was a shipwreck in Plymouth Harbour that I had been part of my dive training. And it was I think it was a World War II wreck, and it sits in, I think, 26 meters. And the bare structure of it, so most of the kind of cladding of the side of the ship is gone. The bare structure is there, and it had guns and all sorts on it. But the external structure was covered in dead man's fingers, a kind of, basically all sorts of marine life. And it was really beautiful. But you have quite a short dive time on a scuba trip. And anyway, I said to him, is it possible to free dive the James Egan Lane, which is the name of this ship? And he was like, well, if you can hold your breath for 2.5 minutes, then yes. And so I hung up the phone and I held my breath for 3 minutes, something sitting at my kitchen table. And I called him up again and said, like, when is the next course? And it was a few weeks from then. So I signed up, and on that course, I held my breath longer than he did during the demonstration. And he said, you need to try out for the freediving team. The trials are in 5 weeks, I think. So I didn't really have any time for training because I was studying at the time. But I went down and on that of that trial, I held my breath longer than anybody else, even the men, in the pool. But I'd never done it in water before in a competition scenario, so I pushed myself too far and actually got disqualified. But I learned a massive amount there, and still made it into the. Now, did I get myself disqualified? I can't remember. Anyway, whatever happened, I made it into the British team with a breath hold of 5.5 minutes or something like that, which had totally surprised them for someone who'd never had any other formal training. And then that was the start of it. And then a few weeks later, I was went out to France to train with the French team, and then eventually was competing in Ibiza, I think, for the first year for the UK.
That is so crazy. Just
Oh.
wow. So when you guys were doing I guess when you started that, were you prior to that? Because I think anyone would feel that 3 minutes just sitting at your table, and then 5.5 minutes are just like freakishly long breath holds. Were you an endurance athlete or anything prior to that?
N- No, but let's say I did no, I wasn't. I'd say I'd be more endurance than the opposite. But I definitely, so I think I've got a naturally big lung capacity. I also, what became obvious really quickly is that compared to most people, when you start holding your breath, certainly when you're holding your breath and you're in water, you feel quite quickly that your body kind of shuts down a bit and your blood will pull back from your extremities. You get kind of cold hands. And that all happens very, very quickly for me. And I'm super relaxed underwater. That's one thing I have always been.
Hmm.
And so at point when some people will say, don't you find it kind of claustrophobic being at 20 meters underwater if you're holding your breath down at that sort of depth? And I'm like the absolute opposite. I feel like underwater, there's a sense, particularly underwater and without the tanks on, you have ultimate freedom. You can move in 3 dimensions. You're in this kind of liquid form. I found it absolutely peaceful and super calming. So clearly I have some biological, what's the word?
Like predisposition.
Yeah, to freediving. But yeah, I couldn't put it down to a particular kind of sports training before because I was, one of the last picked when it came to when it came to up there to sports usually.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I don't, it's fascinating. I was actually just kind of coincidentally within the last couple of weeks was listening to a podcast. I didn't know there are sea nomad tribes in Indonesia, and it
Mm.
sounds like in other places around the world, but a lot of what they, I mean, basically everything that they harvest is from the sea. So these people
Mhm.
are sea, like free divers, and have just been
Yep.
doing that for who knows how many thousands of years. And they found that a lot of them have these extra large there's some your spleen plays some sort of role in storing
Yep.
extra red blood cells, so you can get like a boost of extra oxygenated blood into your body. And I wonder if you have a crazy spleen like that. Just it's interesting.
Uh, I had a US lab do a load of research at one point, but actually they were focused mostly on like what is your heart doing when it's
Hmm.
trying to pump really hard at the end of a long breath hold. Yeah, I'm not sure that they looked at the spleen, to be honest. But the spleen does have it does play a massive part in it all. And one thing, let's say, I mean, we had a theory at some point that maybe because my mum is Swiss, like maybe there's an alpine adaptation, like from Swiss mountains. Maybe there's an alpine adaptation that has come in sort of the Swiss people living in mountain regions. Don't know. But I mean, I being the scientist at the time, I was constantly kind of analyzing this, like overall the lessons I was learning. Um, and there was, in terms of the spleen, there was one thing I noticed very clearly the first time we went out to train before a competition that after 4 days of diving multiple times every day, to the point of, pushing yourself past, certainly in terms of depth, past the point where you get the sensation in your diaphragm to breathe. That basically after 4 days, it feels to me like there's a massive jump. And then after 10 days again, there's a massive jump in ability. And that was what happened for my body. And that you could almost feel, let's say even the beginning of the day before diving, I felt that something was a bit different. And that must be some kind of adaptation of the spleen, your body basically realizing that you're going to need this buildup of resources on a regular basis, and to have that ready. But also within the space of a single training session, you would always get your longest breath hold. For me, it was normally on the fourth attempt. So you do a whole series, and in that time, that gives your body and your spleen the time to release the extra red blood cells into your blood, so that when you do a final breath hold, that you have got generally greater oxygen capacity in your blood.
Wow. It is, when you stop and think about it, it is kind of mind blowing how adaptable humans are. Just
Human
it
body is, yeah,
that
yeah.
that's insane. And it's, I've I'd heard that sequestering that the spleen does is common in all mammals. Like they can teach mice. They like some researchers have basically taught mice to free dive to an extent. Obviously, it's not doing something that you were, or to the extent that you were doing, but they can. It's weird. There's something in us, whether that's just evolutionarily, if we, shrews that they think we came from the sea at one point or what. But it's so fascinating to me. Did that?
Yeah, I mean, like, partly adapting to coming out of a womb, a womb experience, and then being able to come out of that, you need to be able to be without oxygen for a significant amount of time.
Yeah. So is your research, I know that down at the Great Barrier Reef, that was in college, but was your work as a geneticist what ended up eventually taking you out of the water and creating Conservation Without Borders, or what's the progression there?
So not really. So whilst my childhood, even I'd say, I was really, always found mathematics and everything that was kind of be on the basis of genetics kind of interesting and exciting. Definitely had a mathematics teacher that taught it to me very differently to how a lot of people are taught it. Like, that maths is like exploring. And at one point he said, it's like, you imagine you've got a challenge you're trying to face. And this is a massive mountain to climb. And he described like that. And then he said, when you get to the top of the mountain, though, with mathematics, you go, yes, for a moment. But then once you've solved that, you look out and you can see like hundreds of other mountains that are possible to climb. And he taught it like that as well. So that was brilliant. So mathematics and the data and science was actually super exciting to me, and yeah, where my interest lay. However, when it came to conservation and actually working with different species, I had to come to the, I guess, awkward realization after a few years that actually, whilst we were able to gather quite a lot of amazing data on species in decline and figure out why, it was quite hard to get people to do much based on data. And whilst humans desperately want to believe that we are rational creatures, and I desperately did as well, I was like, surely we just need to write more papers explaining why. And surely everybody, like nobody wants species to go into decline. I still believe that. I don't think anyone really wants to be behind the loss of species. But yeah, trying to make data move people was very hard. But I eventually realized that actually quite often you need to find some other way of making the data mean something to people. And the big, stop me if you're trying to make me go in some other direction here, but the big realization to me happened actually working on the shark nets off the coast of Sydney, where I grew up. And so I'd left actually Australia. I'd been in the UK and Europe for quite some time when I went back and realized that actually what I thought the shark nets were, which was some sort of exclusion thing that keeps sharks away from swimmers, was absolutely not what they were. I started to swim out to them and found lots of things that weren't harmful caught in them, and that they were just random pieces of net catching stuff that's going past. And I was a bit upset by this, and I asked for the information on what sorts of things were caught there, and it wasn't available. It wasn't able to be shared. At that point, obviously, that piqued my interest of why would you not share that? It took me down a bit of a rabbit hole. I eventually had to go through Freedom of Information to get all the data from the past few decades, and it was pretty horrifying. Like the number of things that are completely harmless that were being caught in it, and including things that were in drastic decline, and all for something that wasn't keeping sharks away from swimmers anyway. It was like this weird placebo thing of telling people you've got this net here. Anyway, people, despite having all the data and various different scientists and conservation organizations all collaborating on it, struggled to get anyone to really care. And so I started going out with my camera and taking photographs of things that were caught in shark nets. And people are people are so used to seeing fish basically in nets, that fish and marine animals, to be honest, that we got a bit more interest in that, but not that much. And then once I become Australian freediving champion, because I went from the UK, then I moved back to Australia to compete there. Once I became Australian freediving champion, everybody wanted to know what I had to say about shark nets. And at the time, I was absolutely horrified, because I was like, why is it that, like, as a scientist, and then with all these other scientists on board, we weren't able to get the interest from it. And then I realized, like, if the way to make this story relevant is either A, being a sports personality, or B, the fact that I was often wearing a wetsuit and a monofin, a single fin, so you look a little bit like a dolphin or a whale, although no female wants to compare themselves into a whale, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um, the um, the if that is what it takes to make the message mean something to people, or to allow them to imagine, like, the waste or the kind of the unnecessary suffering or the illogic nature of this, a program like this, if that's what it takes, and why am I fighting human nature? And so that sent me off down a journey of, working with scientists, realizing that that wasn't done very well in a lot of ways, and that on lots of areas where we've got brilliant data, like, why don't we get politicians or companies or anybody else responding? Like, nobody wants this on their conscience, and yet I don't think, if it's not getting through to people in a way that makes them, I guess I think maybe there's a bit of a stick, but there's also a carrot. Like, you could be the hero in this situation. Then we were going to keep on failing. So in the end, I've ended up kind of exploring that whole area as much as a science as anything else. Like, really strategically, what is it what story or stories or experiences or something else is going to make the right people decide that actually they want to help us.
I guess you've obviously thought a lot about this. So, what do you think it is about the science itself that doesn't sell the message? Is it because of, oh, well, you have to go find scholarly articles to delve into it? Do you think there's a role in something like this for the more, I mean, you're doing it right now, being a more public scholar, and you see these kinds of people in different scientific fields, whether it be astronomy or physics and whatever. But do you think that's the issue with is just the
Mhm.
delivery mechanism of the science?
Yeah, it depends, I guess, and that's what I do now, is like the strategic thinking behind where do we want to get to. Quite often, so the science and the scientists want to be presenting facts and data, and in order to basically to get for data to be, like, highly respected and published, you need to not be sensational at all,
Mhm.
and also present purely what do we know to be true and what not. And so there is definitely an element of that, is what do we want to do about it? And there's probably gaps in the what makes sense, what should we actually do about it? That's often where politicians have to make a decision, and the scientists are actually very comfortable giving people, this is the issue, um, and but tend to not delve into this is what we should do about it, because that is subjective. Like, someone has to make a decision. Do we want these species to go into decline? What kind of decline is acceptable? There's all sorts of questions around judgment there. And that's one thing. Quite often, if it's not, quite often, say, for example, with the swans in many other countries, if the issue isn't high up in public, in the public kind of perception, public awareness, then and you're asking them to make a change that some people might find uncomfortable, there's no way that's no way that's gonna fly. So you've really got to add a level of public awareness there. There's also no repercussions for species going decline in most circumstances, which I find really quite shocking. Yeah, no one's going to go back, even if your company, say your stretch of power lines has been killing everything, like, or lots of things that are going along a flyway, there is nothing in the future that says, okay, in 20 years' time, if this species goes extinct and you are a significant part of that problem, there is no yeah, there's very little chance that that's actually going to be a risk. And for, companies where CEOs are moving all the time, does that company see that as a risk? Not really.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's all of those things, but I guess a key part that we try and do is to focus on the individuals, so public, but also individuals who could make a real difference. And quite often for me, it's the industries that we're involved in. So if we get onto the Swan story at some point, there one of the big targets was hunting. So we could measure different hunting impacts. We didn't know exactly where it was happening or why or who these hunters were. But I realized early on that, the scientists could be publishing papers till the cows come home, but there's no way in the world that information is reaching a single hunter. And just maybe I can get a load of hunters on side and actually make them want to help us rather than, leave it to a question of a few temporary politicians to expect them to be the ones to really make the change. I think the easiest way I could do it is to get a load of the hunters involved to help. So that's also where we really focus.
Yeah, and I'm going to pause here because I want to a couple things came up, but we'll come back to this starting with the swans and getting hunters
Okay.
involved. I promise.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
you
no worries.
don't need to apologize. So I guess because you said a couple things there, two specifically that stood out to me like immediately as you were saying them. One, with science, for it to be recognized and respected, it needs to not be sensationalized because they're trying to find the truth of things. So that creates an interesting dynamic because it is intentionally not sensationalized because you're trying to have the science respected, but that flies entirely counter to what it takes to get, at least in conventional media, to get something, a traditional news outlet to pick that up. If it's not sensational, they're not going to pick it up. And then at the same time, I wonder, and I'm curious if you've thought of this, because the scientists doing that work and publishing those papers are there because they are interested in finding those truths, do you feel like there's a disconnect between almost incentives there? Because yes, they're there to get the truth, but their focus and their time and so much of their energy is entirely focused on finding the truths that then once it is out, the idea is get this published so I can get more funding for the next grant, for the next paper to continue along this linear progression that science tends to be. And so that is where some of that, I guess, momentum behind it almost gets lost and then doesn't get communicated to the wider world.
So that is often where the conservation organizations would step in.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, there is. So so for anyone for all of those for years who've called kind of scientists or claimed that scientists were sensationalizing climate science, I would always go, oh my gosh, if you're finding that something that a climate scientist is saying is sensational, that's not because they're sensationalizing. It is because it's quite, it's quite big data. It's quite big, shocking stuff there that they can say completely rationally. But yeah, so there is, I don't think it should probably be the role of the scientist to try and actually change things. Yeah, definitely the idea of communicating your science is great as well, but the focus certainly in most academic circles and for a young scientist is a focus on like making sure that people can understand your science as opposed to creating the impact from it. So yeah, that is an area where the conservation organizations would step in. I mean, there's also limitations from a conservation organization point of view in that they are require funding to operate. And for that, there's a lot of issues that are easy to fundraise against from the public and from governments and from other funders. And they tend to be ones where you've got a guaranteed outcome. So you're kind of planting trees or you're doing something which has got a very, a funder can see, I'll give you this money and you'll deliver X. Yeah. And that is great. But by default, that means you quite often can't really tackle the sticky problems in conservation. So, for example, I had a couple of brands and organizations completely pull out of the Swan expedition. I won't mention this again. Specifically, one of them was, run by a vegan, and he was not happy with me speaking with hunters. And I was like, well, every single person in the Arctic is a hunter because they don't have agriculture. They're relying on, well, mushrooms and berries. They don't have agriculture up there. They're relying on fish, reindeer, and birds. So I, this is a requirement. All of the, I got what, about a fifth of the birds are going up and using that around the world, are using that section of the globe. So it's actually a really important audience for us. And so yeah, there's a bit of that. There's also, and this is just a I'd say kind of is it a catch-22? Maybe I haven't thought about this well enough, but where you are trying to fundraise against, again, I'll use hunting as an example, trying to fundraise against hunting. If you're trying to raise money from the public, the easiest way is to have a cute animal and a very clear, easy bad guy. And a hunter makes a very good, cute, easy bad guy. But essentially, I have taken the approach of seeing anybody who we've considered as the bad guy or an industry or something that is causing the decline of a species. They are, whether we like it or not, they are the potential hero in this situation. And that's the way they need to see themselves. And so just by default, as soon as you start, if you set up a battle relationship between a conservation organization who in reality, what they mostly want is for the species to come back and prosper. But if the only way they can get there is by making a baddie out of the person that we need help from, we have sometimes caused rifts and battles and complete blocks in conservation that take 30, 40, 50 years and make people just dig in harder and keep, stop us from coming to any kind of resolution. And so I might have got into a kind of complex territory there, but I like to explain it when I explain it as, because kind of conservation organizations are beholden to a membership and a fundraising models and all that sort of thing. And also a lot of their members won't necessarily be excited about the idea of collaborating with hunters. They are led by a certain stream. And when I kept looking at a lot of these big sticky problems in conservation, I kept going, imagine if nature had her own special agents. What would nature do if those special agents didn't need to raise funds for themselves? They didn't need to get their own brand out there. They didn't need to do all those other things. What if they literally just had to look at the situation and go, right, what's going to lead to the best outcome for nature? Who can I work with? And, for a conservation organization, sometimes it would be hard to say, look, we've formed a partnership with a hunting organization to do this. Because a lot of their members would cancel their membership. People cancel their membership when you start talking about cats in the UK. When you start talking about cats eating wildlife, which is a problem. So it's a very sensitive model there. So yeah, in essence, I think we work a bit like an MI5 for nature, where we'll kind of look at the bigger picture and try and see, what would nature do? And who are our best allies for this particular situation. And I find it really exciting. We can go a little bit into my my Swiss background, and I can maybe able to explain why I've ended up being comfortable in that area of sticky problems and pulling apart conflict, as well as the adventure side.
Yeah, can we dig into some of that? What you were just talking about in terms of, I think from I think given the subject matter and that we are talking about, the messaging behind, this doesn't have to, these themes that we're talking about doesn't have to always be in a wildlife conservation context. These can be in other areas where it's, these lessons that you've had of trying to convey a message, these strategies and thoughts that you've kind of found these. So I think some of what you said is important to talk about and know that I guess first, are you cool taking a little detour into that for right now?
Yeah.
Okay. And so with that, I'm posing this for the sake of conversation. I'm not digging my heels in one way or the other here. So, but I think, well, I know, because you had mentioned, like, you've been very accurately, like, especially bringing up the hunting thing can be that can be a button for people.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm curious. Because that is almost if we're using that example, and you kind of use it where, these guys someone has to be the bad guy. Yes, they can also be the hero, but if people are, at least in the United States, like hunting actually funds a lot of conservation in the States. It's just the way that it's structured. But so if those, say that these guys have to be the bad guys in at least in from your perspective of doing this messaging or in this campaign that you're trying to do, I think the where a lot of the pushback probably comes from is that, yeah, well, if I'm the hunter or if I'm a hunter, now I'm feeling villainized. And it
Mhm.
may be that it's not a whole picture. And I think the other side of that is also almost like you said, okay, if you've got a wealthy gentleman who is also a vegan funding this campaign, he's really going to want to villainize. Like there are,
Mhm.
there's, everyone has their own motives going on behind the scenes. And I guess, how do you, this is where I wanted to go with this is
Mhm.
like with a campaign, like with doing for the flight of the swans, the human swan and all that, being that
Mhm.
the hunters were involved. I mean, on your end, regardless of what your own views are on hunters, how do you manage something like that as okay? Because it sounds like you're doing things very thoughtfully, and it seems to me ethically from the perspective of yes, even if this has to get our messaging across, these guys can also be the good guys in this story too. Like it's playing both sides of that coin. Um,
Ye-
how do you
Yeah.
manage that?
So I would say, like I said right at the beginning at one point, that I go into most things assuming nobody wants to be behind the decline of a species. I also
Yeah.
look at nature from as much of a bird's eye view, so from as high up as possible. And so my main area of focus isn't in sort of animal welfare, as some people say. It's in like the population level species. You know, is the planet our ecosystems functioning healthily here? So that's where I want to go. I go into most things assuming that nobody wants to be the bad guy. And I don't think I've met, there are individual outliers, I'd say, who have their own uh, crazy moral standards, but most people don't want to be behind the decline of the species.
Yeah, it's a common
And
ground.
yeah, and so that is it. But there are some significant differences. So I was pretty sure that of all, so let's take it speaking to people before the project about the hunting risk. So it feels a bit weird that we're talking about this without actually mentioning the project or what the hell I did. But anyway,
We
speak about it
can.
beforehand.
Yeah.
Well, we can go into this next maybe.
Okay.
So I had scientists from 11 different countries all talking about the different threats to the birds that they were declining. They do this migration from Russia to the UK. They were declining. We knew hunting was an issue. 1 in 3 birds, when we catch them and X-ray them, have got shot. This is living birds have got shot in their tissue, so they're being
Oh,
shot somewhere.
okay.
Also, the eating of lead pellets when they've been shot out of a shotgun and they've landed on the ground is an issue. It kills about 1 million water birds across Europe a year and has a significant impact on about or poison, say, 3 million others, and that causes other types of death. So it's a pretty big issue. So hunting was definitely definitely an issue. However, when people spoke about hunters, everything I could hear, uh, the there was an assumption that because papers had been published, that it was out there in the world, and I knew that really wasn't the case. Certainly, sometimes it was a hunting association, but a national one that interacted with something. But again, it was unlikely that that had ever been communicated out to ordinary hunters. So yeah, there was definitely a lack of information. I was pretty sure getting to places, but also when I looked at the map of what the whole migration looked like, so the variety of the different habitats and environments that the hunters were in, when people spoke about hunters, there was this perception, even from everybody involved in my project, that they were probably imagining a big, burly, macho, older Russian bloke, or like a young Russian. And so lots of people said to me, and if you try and go up there speaking about hunting to hunters, they'll shoot at you. And I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure hunters are going to look like a very different thing to what you imagine. And so, yeah, it was one of the things I found on the way up there. In one area, most of the hunting is done by kids between 9 and 12 years old on their way to school. So in the morning, that's just as one example. There were many different colors and flavors of hunters in different areas. And yeah, so there was I guess there's I'm always interested in like digging a bit deeper into like what are the different flavors of I know perceptions of this group of people. And also, whilst we had we had some anonymous data as well on like communities, which ones said that someone near them is likely to shoot a swan in the next year, for example. I realized that you're missing if you don't go there in person, you're missing some really big factors. And for me, it was like when you land, I feel like, and I'm jumping ahead of this, but when you land in a paramotor in a remote community, and because I'm landing and I'm not necessarily always able to get to the site that we've said that we're going to aim for, where there might be an official who's ready there to be the barrier against you speaking to ordinary people and is filtering what you're allowed to hear. I can pretty much land anywhere. And if you land in a community and can make like basically people's reaction, from that you can pretty quickly get an idea of, what do they think about swans from their initial reaction to you? And nobody sees someone landing out of the sky in a paramotor as a scientist or someone coming to tell them something. Normally they think you need help, but you get a really good idea of kind of who they are, what they think about swans from the first element of the story, and who in the community do they all look to when this weird woman turns up out of nowhere. And that person is the person who probably is going to be your best ally, because they're the one they turn to when there's some kind of, stress or confusion or something. So he or she is one of our best allies. So I think that is it. My approach is generally to assume that people will help if you give them a route to do so, and if you allow them to see themselves as a good guy and not form make a barrier of saying, I'm here as the good guy and you're the bad guy, and I'm going to make you change and whip you over the head with statistics until you change.
Yeah. No, I know that was kind of weird for you to almost probably talk about things out of order than you're used to, but I felt like that was important to hear. And I mean, yes, I was curious, but also for other people to hear. That's because we do that othering thing that humans tend to do, and that definitely gets, I feel like, magnified and a lot, at least in the, again, the sensationalized stuff that we tends to make it to the top of the major headlines on things. But it did also kind of converge timelines for us a little bit, because we had stopped at, earlier when I had paused, you were just talking about the hunters. Now you've laid out the problem that was being posed and you've kind of set the groundwork for your 7,000 kilometer migration. So do you want to start telling everybody now about what that was, even though you've hinted at it a little bit?
Yeah. So, and yeah, make sure that I get onto like you made a comment earlier about the like news and the kind of baddies and sensationalizing. So how do we find a different way of doing that? So yeah, essentially, I found myself being asked by scientists from all those different countries to help them with this massive decline of a bird called the Buick swan. It'd been researched for many years, starting in about the 60s, was particularly of interest because each of the birds is identifiable by their face patterns. So there's a kind of method for dissecting, actually in images, not physically, the pattern of their bill, the black and yellow on it, so that you can identify each of them. And we'd named about 10,000 of the birds. So the scientists had named about 10,000 birds. Wow. And so with that, and not having to ring them all the time, there was really detailed knowledge of dynamics and families and dominance in different areas and all that sort of thing. And they're very well loved, and yet we'd lost almost half of them in the previous 20 years. So the bird population, that means about in some years, 1 in 4 don't survive a return migration. And one of the challenges with something like the Buick swan, because it's traveling from the Arctic to the UK, but there and back every year, and it's crossing, 11, 12, 13 borders, depending on the routes that the individuals choose to take. But there were lots of different threats in different countries. And each of those different countries had a different level of either wealth, how seriously they took conservation, level of development, different languages, and all the rest of it. So there's a real challenge. And with most migratory species, they suffer from the fact that any country that there's their breeding ground on one end of that migration flyway or their wintering ground on the other end, those countries at either end tend to have the species on their priority list to look after, but most of the countries in the middle don't, because they're only like they're temporary transient species.
Yeah.
And yet they rely on, it's exhausting to do those long for a swan. It's exhausting to do those long flights. So when they land, they really, really need that wetland that they stop off at, where they will rest away in the middle of the water, away from predators, but also where they can eat water plants. Each of those wetlands is really important because they land exhausted. You only have to disturb them, 50 times and they're out of fuel, and that's it. So yeah, they suffer from all those issues. But with the Buick Swan, so yes, there was hunting as an issue. There was, as in being shot at. There was them eating lead pellets, because all water birds do that. They have a very muscular gizzard, so they grind up the grass and things, and they eat small pebbles. And if that happens to be lead, that will get into their blood. So we had that as an issue. Collisions with power lines was a massive issue. It's probably one of the biggest killers of swans en route. But if you don't know where that's happening, we don't know, which sites to focus on putting diverters on, for example. In lots of areas, the wetland habitats have disappeared. In some areas, 90% of the wetlands have gone. So there were lots of different issues, essentially. What they were trying, and their frustration was that nobody seems to be listening. What we talked about earlier, there's tons of data and nobody seems to be listening. No one's reading the paper. Countries aren't making them a priority. And I was being asked to see if I could find a way of getting all those different industries to meetings. And I looked at the whole situation. And as an Australian, reasonably recently out of a kind of an Australian context and working on sharks and turtles and bigger, perhaps more exciting things, I'd initially thought kind of ducks, geese, and swans were a little bit boring.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say that. When I first looked at the map they were showing me and looked at the extent of that migration, and I started to imagine this incredible journey, I just thought, if we want to engage with all those people, like getting them to meetings isn't going to work fast enough if you're just telling a story of all the threats, which is what happens, all these different ways of birds die. People don't want to hear that story. But I think if you told this story in a right way of the birds that start off up in the Russian Arctic, in the land of reindeer breeders and polar bears, and they're flying across some of the most vast and untouched wetlands on the planet. And then they're crossing this taiga forest, which is a very dense forest into Europe. And all that time they're with young who are only a few weeks old, and they've got this icy Arctic winter on their tail, and they're being shot at. Like, there's a James Bond story. And I just thought, having grown up in rural parts of Australia and other areas where hunting is a pretty normal thing, I just had this, as an example, I just had this certainty that if you could start with that story and people realize they weren't all like, we have another species of swan called the mute swan, which in the UK don't migrate, but people love them and they don't, they're around most of the time. If people had any idea that they were doing this mad migration, I think that would be that's my better opener for a conversation. But yeah, I sat on this idea for a long time thinking, how can I tell that story? Can we somehow put cameras on birds and like tell a story that way? But cameras were still kind of too big. Could we station people along the flyway and bring the story to life that way? But one of the challenging things about this species is that they're going across very uninhabited places where there are no kind of roads or runways or anything for thousands of kilometers. So yeah, instead, I and at the time I was using a paramotor to do aerial photography for wetlands, because you could get so much data as well as story and explain the importance of a wetland habitat by
Go ahead.
by showing people an aerial image, basically, of what the wetland looks like now. Like, it's one thing to have a Google image, but just say, I went up yesterday after rain, and this is what we can see where that, this farm runoff is going into this bit of wetland. We know this is responsible for this. You could tell a lot of information from, being images from the air. So yeah, I took away this idea of how can I get all these different people to meetings. And eventually I was flying my paramotor one day, had a new wing, which was a bit faster, and the birds were on a migration and they were crossing the English Channel. So they're doing a pretty straight line there. And I suddenly went, oh my God, I'm doing the same speed as a swan called Hope. And then I went, oh my God, maybe I could actually bring this story to life by flying the whole route with them. And it seemed ridiculous. So I sat on it for months, but yeah, eventually it was one of those things that was obviously eating away at me. And eventually I wrote it up in a one-pager and sent it off to the scientists. And that was the start of trying to make some impossible journey happen.
So you were just using that at work and
Mhm.
happened. Wow. That sounds like something out of a movie. It totally does. But
I hadn't done really long flights. I've done flights that were like the capacity of a tank of fuel. So kind of 3 hours, but not done any long kind of expeditions from then. But that was I've set off on it was about 2 years in the planning, pulling together, is this possible? How would you do it? And then slowly ticking off all of those boxes. I've listened to a couple of your previous podcasts where people are talking about breaking down challenges into tiny pieces, and that's kind of what I had to do with this one.
jeez, yeah. How the hell do you? I mean, if a gas tank lasts 3 hours and you're going
Mhm.
7,000 kilometers, I guess on one hand, I'm curious about how you did break that up into where it was supported, but also, I guess, to what in any extent were you literally like, were you following a specific flock or were you just following this path that is taken, this pilgrimage that they take every year?
So we had from a we had GPS collars on 20 birds who had, so they'd left the UK and they were up and they're distributed out across the Russian Arctic. When they're breeding, they're spread out quite far because a pair will take a wetland and they're the only Buick Swans on there. So they're very spread out. We
Okay.
can't see where they all are when they're out there because the tracks actually communicate through mobile phone towers. So we don't actually, but they record regular data. We just don't get the information download until we get the regular data. So when they are about to migrate back towards back towards the west, they will gather most of them will gather in this one huge bay right before migration. So they'll be there. There's plenty of water plants there. So they're basically feeding up before they set off on the big migration. But when they do, it's in waves. So there'll be a group, ones that can move will go. Quite often it's, adults that haven't got young with them and don't have to wait till the young are grown enough. They might go first. And so the migration happens over weeks. So from the first ones leaving to the last ones leaving, it could be a month, depending on the conditions and all the rest of it. So we didn't know when our different birds would be setting off. The key thing on with me flying with them on migration was that I didn't need to be close to them in the air in order to, there's no information to be gathered from that. Where the real information was when we were following these birds, looking at where the tracks were going on migration. Any time they did anything unusual, or they avoided a certain area, or they landed and took off again, or they turned around and went north again, all of which happened. I was able to go there at the same time and figure out what and why. So from our first bird leaving to the last bird leaving, I think was about a 2-week period. So throughout my expedition, I was between the first and the last bird and exploring kind of what was going on. And yeah, so I didn't need to see them in the air to be able to gather information, but to know when they left, why they left, what was the conditions like where they came from, how much disturbance is there, what level of pollution, is there still food there, and also how many kind of people and what do these people think about swans.
Wow. That is just, I mean, the freaking logistics of that alone, just because the distance
Mhm.
alone,
Well,
all
yes.
of it. It sounds like, I mean, because you said it was 2.5 years you've been prepping for that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first recce trip I did. So to be honest, when I first, there was a little. there were several steps that made it go from an idea, from like giving it to Julia. There was also a moment that I tested. I wanted to test my idea with people that I thought would genuinely be a good devil's advocate.
Mhm.
And so at one point, I'd called up a guy called Richard Meredith Hardy, he's a long-time explorer and aviator. He's definitely an individual. He's been on various kind of global bodies for aviation, but he can fly a one-person balloon. He's done competitions where you have to do like transnational journeys at great altitudes to get, to travel in different directions. He was one of the first to ever fly a paramotor over the English Channel. And this was in the days where paramotors were super heavy, so really, really hard to take off from. And he flies microlights. Anyway, he basically does everything in aviation.
Okay.
And I was like, I put on my big girl pants, if we're allowed to say that, and I tried to call him, and then I sent him a message. No, I sent him an email, and I said, look, I've had this idea that would, I think, have a massive impact for Swans. It'd be really successful. However, I can see some massive the logistical issues. And I think what I actually was asking was, I'd love to talk to him about it, but also I would need to have aviators in each country in order to help me pick apart like what would be the main blocks and challenges in all those countries. And I knew he'd flown paramotors before. And his email back to me just said, call me. And at that point, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a point where I'm going to be berated for being this girl who I've been flying paragliders and paramotors for a bit, but for work, I had not done any long distance journeys. And actually, his call was he basically just listened to the why and the where and everything else. And then he was like, okay, leave it with me. And then next thing you know, he sent an email and copied in an aviator in all those different countries, or somebody who would know somebody. And with that, the cat was kind of out of the bag at the point. It was still a secret, and I could still pull out. But at this point, I was like, okay, like let's see. This is another step. Am I going to find that I will get people in all those countries wanting to collaborate on this? And so that was one step. And the other was, I mean, at the point where we had no funding at all, so you needed, this was a weird thing. Like, who was going to fund a completely untried and untested method where there was one element of gathering extra data en route, but a big part of it was that had to have faith that I was going to be able to interact with all these strangers. There's kind of hunters and fish farmers and Joe blogs and Russian politicians. Why would you trust me to be able to be persuasive with all these people? So anyway, I wrote to Ranulph Fiennes, who I knew had some good contacts in Russia as well. And I don't know if you know who he is in the US, but he so in the UK we call him the greatest living explorer. He's kind of done every mountain or whatever or the else. He's in his late 70s now.
Randolph Fiennes, is that what you said?
Sir Ranulph Fiennes, yes, he's related to the different Fienneses who are actors.
Okay.
If you will know of them. But yeah, he's very well known in the UK. And anyway, he invited me to his house, and he and a colleague of his quizzed me. A guy called Anton Bowering, who he did a massive expedition with many years ago called the Transglobe Expedition. They kind of went right around the whole planet. And anyway, they quizzed me, and Ran is famous for getting frostbite once and then sawing his own fingers off because he got the dead bits essentially.
I feel like I've heard that before. Okay.
Yeah, he's very pragmatic. But anyway, he quizzed me to the nth degree, or they both did, and then eventually he just said, I still it looks like a very, very challenging project, and I'm not sure what your chance of overall success is, but the world needs a lot more mad but marvelous. And that was the strap line that they'd given to their trust that funds expeditions. And he said, and if anyone can do it, I think you can. And so with that, he was the first to put some money behind it.
Wow.
And once in the UK, once you have Ranulph Fiennes giving it his backing and his offer of support and letter writing to everyone from Richard Branson to Russian explorers, with that opened the floodgates, and other people stepped up as well to help. So
what did that?
It didn't help in Russia because what?
What did that feel like? I mean, these are obviously world renowned adventurers who sound like they were genuinely excited by the fact that you were doing this. Like,
Yeah. I mean, what did that feel like? I mean, I can't say I wasn't pretty nervous as I walked up to the front door of the house when I first went in there. But
yeah,
to be honest, there was there was definitely a power for me, like a confidence in the fact that I not only was there, I was doing it for a purpose that was like much bigger than me. You wouldn't choose to, if you wanted a fun paramotoring trip, you would not choose to do this. Like there are much more easy and like in the easily fun things. So I was
yeah,
doing it for a good cause, and I also was 100% convinced that we would have an impact, like for various different reasons, not only on the data, but I just knew that it would work. So there was a confidence that came with that, that I guess um, made putting the ideas out there easy. The other thing is, I suppose, let's say I I'd through various kind of things earlier, I had an attitude of basically seeking the people that were going to tell you stuff was impossible and seeking the naysayers. And essentially, they were your best kind of stress test of, you know, what might go wrong that you hadn't thought of, how impossible are these things. And so even if, even if he was going to tell me, that it was ridiculous, at least he was going to give me the time to explain why. And so, if anything, I felt like this was basically, free advice. And I wasn't totally beholden to this idea. I was up for if this really couldn't work for some reason, if somebody could tell me why it wouldn't, then great. But, even someone like that giving you their time, I was like, at least I'm onto something.
yeah. It honestly, I feel like just in talking with you for, the hour or whatever that we've had so far, and then what I know about you, I feel like you would have made it happen anyways. But I admire the fact that you were, I mean, like you said, that is like the best way to pressure test is reach out to who are probably the most qualified
Mm.
people to be doing this. And if they shoot it down, okay, they may like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe they shot a hole in the bottom of your boat, but like now you know how you can plug it.
Yeah,
Just,
exactly. And I had other people that definitely told me it wasn't. So I had somebody who works for the UK RAF who said who'd heard that I had some plan going, and he offered to meet me and help with logistics. And from a an RAF point of view, when I basically spelled it out in a couple of sentences at the beginning, and he just turned to me and said, "Look, I'm sorry, I deal in the possible, and this is not it." And he basically that was it. He wasn't interested.
wow.
And this was early on, and you could see that from an RAF point of view, there would be so many things. Even there's no way that someone's going to give that the Russian politicians, whatever, are going to give the RAF permission for something like this. I mean, the levels of paperwork, whatever, would have been ridiculous. But I knew, like, actually, we've got some other things under our belt. I'm pretty sure, like, Russians and hunters and lots of people will be fascinated by a crazy lady wanting to do this. And my name is Sasha, which is the most common, probably Russian man's name, or one of the most common Russian men's names. So I might slip under the radar with people thinking I might be a Russian man.
You're one of us. Yeah.
And yeah, I thought there were other ways. Anyway, he didn't just walk out. He did list all the different things, including that there's no way they'll give you permissions, all these things. So I kind of knew from that what things were going to be what things are going to be my like big blocks to test. I had my to-do list was growing faster than I could tick things off it. And I knew that I would never have ticked off, I wouldn't have accounted for every single eventuality on something like this. But people like him were giving me the big things I had to tick off.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it makes so much sense, but also just the balls that takes to have reached out to those guys. It's so awesome. All of it. It's so
And you've
cool.
obviously learned to reach out to all kinds of people through your podcast, right? And
Yeah. A little different though, because I'm like,
yeah.
I, yeah, I don't know.
Did you think in the early days they would all say yes?
Oh, they still don't, but it's gotten to where it's more and more. I mean, like cold contacting you worked, which was kind of, I'm still at the point where when someone does say yes, I'm like, holy shit, they said yes, you know.
Really? I think, I mean, you have an incredible personal story that I think people want to hear and they are intrigued by. And this project was another example of that. Like people, even if they instinct was to say no, they still wanted to go. But who is the crazy person that wants to do this? There's an intrigue about the kind of the person behind the story.
I do feel like that's probably given me an advantage in the cold contacting people because it's,
Hmm.
yeah, it's like, hey, you may not have heard of, you've most likely have not heard of this podcast, but there is a
Yeah,
crazy story behind it all, I guess at least. But huh,
absolutely.
yeah, I don't know. It's just this is all. It's so cool, and it's so. I feel like where we were at, we made it to the point where yes, you were
Yeah.
landing in Russia and talking to random people, the Swan lady. Like, so how
Oh,
long
wait,
did,
maybe
go ahead.
a quick piece. Sorry that I should add in there because you were saying like, how did it feel asking these people? So this wasn't the end of my asking people, because despite all of this, we still didn't get any response from Russian authorities, not even the Russian ambassador in the UK. So I didn't have the permissions basically to do any of it and it was getting later and later. And so I eventually thought, apart from having, so Ranulph Fiennes agreed to be an ambassador. And then I got David Attenborough as well to be our other ambassador for the project. And thinking, he's Mr. Wildlife. And so I found a fixer on a trip to Russia who was brilliant. He was helping me with trying to work with the kind of authorities and logistics and everything else. And he called me up and he was like, "Oh, Sasha, the Russian films, all your David Attenborough wildlife films are all dubbed in Russia. So people don't really have an association with David Attenborough. And Ranulph Fiennes is a British explorer and we've got our own in Russia. So that's a negative for you."
Yeah.
But he was the one that said to me, "But what Russians really love is James Bond. And I've noticed that your last name is Dench. Is there any chance that you're related to M from James Bond? And could you get her as an ambassador?" So it was actually a Canadian cousin of mine. They did a bit of research and found there's a distant relation, in that I think she's my so my great great grandfather is her great grandfather, but he was a bigamist, so he married twice, and I'm from the second illegitimate wife of Bessie from Battersea. And so I wrote to her saying, we're distantly related, and we badly could do with your support for this project. We think we might get response from Russian authorities if you're part of it. And anyway, she responded, and with like, what a crazy story. How can I possibly say no? And within weeks, we had permission because of that. So that was our foot in the
Jeez.
door. It's pretty. So Judy, thanks to Judy Dent, we got permission and a lot of the media coverage in the early days as well. So yeah, yeah, I guess you just when you have enough momentum and support was happening by that time. All the scientists, conservationists in every country, paramotorists in every country had said, "Yeah, we're up for this." It was an idea that was big and bonkers enough that people were like, "Yeah, okay, if other people are doing it, oh yeah."
Hell yeah.
And a bit of celebrity sparkle, yeah, got the attention of ordinary Russians as well. So yeah. Sorry, now onto your serious question, not about celebrities.
No, that was just, I love hearing all the little tidbits because it is, and I hadn't even thought of this when you were talking earlier on about, yeah, the hunters being the problem and then us talking about some of the conservation stuff, I guess, how it functions in the US. And I hadn't even thought about, okay, you pointed out the fact, yeah, they're crossing, 10, 11, 12 countries. So like,
Mm,
yeah, in the United States, all that, we have federal laws, but it's all the same
yeah.
country. You
Yeah.
don't think about how many, I mean, there were even more moving pieces than I had thought of initially in preparing for this episode. It is just, again, the number of things. I think it's the number of components that had to be there for you to be able to actually make the journey, the number of people that
Mhm.
had to be involved, and the number of things that had to line up, including you guys having, a couple week window to nail down when you're actually going to be flying and what the birds are actually doing. It's just,
Mhm.
it's staggering how much goes into it all. And it's it's just, it's
Yeah.
so intriguing.
Yeah, it was definitely, but if it's like, we had written on the back of the van almost embarrassingly a sign which said one woman something or other 10,000 kilometers, one woman, one mission, 10,000 kilometers. And the reality was, so this one woman was supported by actually quite a few, even in the Russian context, there were a few people behind the scenes that, someone in the world of aviation, air traffic controller, who actually his eyes lit up at this whole project, and he was there like gunning for it behind the scenes, telling me, oh, if you could turn up in this place, that would be really, really great. Somebody else who really understood the kind of Russian media landscape, again, giving me information behind the scenes that you need to write editor this person and this person, and to like blow smoke up this person's ass, if you can say that. And give them some sort of formal role. So we had people behind the scenes in all the countries who were just going, that this is too bonkers, and it's fun to be part of this big collaboration. And so yeah, so there was definitely points where there was so many moving parts and variables, and and we've got the weather on top of everything else. That I we didn't have every single thing on the to-do list ticked off, but knew we had a kind of good enough team in all the different places that, if anything, I felt a bit like a stage diver. People don't talk about stage diving anymore, do they? But when you kind of dive off the stage into the pit, and actually just have
Hope they
faith
catch you.
that when there's when there's a gap, like somebody will fill in the gap,
Yeah.
and that's what repeatedly happened. Like when there was a hurdle, I broke my knee, and I had a number of different people step up. A lady come out of retirement and give me an X-ray, and people construct a three-wheeled thing that I could keep on flying with. It was just, yeah, it was yeah, enough goodwill had been brought up that there would be people there to step up.
That's such a cool thing just about humans, though. Like we do that. It's
Yeah,
usually, yeah. And
yeah,
when people see a cause that they feel is worthy, like they will rally behind it. And it is just,
yeah.
that's so, so cool.
And it isn't always the animal. So this is one thing I learned, that quite often, like whilst the Nanette's people, the people who live up in the Arctic, they were completely comfortable with reindeer, with eating them and having them as pets, but also, using them as transport. Like they're comfortable where we're not happy to have a pet dog and also eat it, for example.
Hmm.
They have a different kind of relationship with animals. But what pretty much anywhere, if the swan story itself wasn't, intriguing to people, it would be, God, if you're prepared to put your body through this, flying in the autumn and winter conditions in that little paramotor, then if you care so much, then I want to know more. And quite often it was that I was being the human vehicle. Whilst initially I fought this idea of being the human swan, because I was like, no, I'm not trying to tell my story. The whole thing is to tell the swan story.
Yeah.
But if I ended up being the vehicle for that, then, so be it. And if it was people caring about me and then actually going, God, and wanting to hear stories about different things other people were doing along the flyway. If those were the stories that resonated with somebody, then I'd run with those.
Oh, no, it's a great story. It really it is. I mean, seems like you, I guess I was about to say, it seems like you achieved what you were going for, but I don't actually know the outcome. So I wanted to, but I mean, at least in the messaging, like, I mean, you fucking captured something. I mean, it's powerful. No, it is. It's just, it's so cool. And
You fucking Captain Dynan, yeah. I'd like that on my epitaph.
or on the back of your next van for your next endeavor, you fucking captured something. Uh,
So yeah, it was like imagine that you had, yeah, a we did manage to get mass public interest. So, and I eventually I realized that early on. That was one of the things that gave me confidence with going ahead with the project in the years preceding, when some things like the Russian permissions, like we weren't making much headway with. I realized at one point that, lots of people had said you never get TV coverage in Russia about swan conservation. It just won't happen. And if you need to reach big audiences, because some of our audience we wanted were in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and yet the fact we started talking about the different things I was doing to prepare for this expedition, and the footage is quite dramatic. I was throwing myself into pools with a full paramotor and a wing and trying to get out of it. I was going to 7,000 feet in a paraglider and making it collapse and trying to recover it. And so stories and that footage, that alone was getting on national television in Russia. So much of that. We knew that because I was getting responses from people like paratroopers who'd been dropped in the Arctic. And one of them wrote me a letter with lots of pictures of all the ways I would definitely die if I tried to fly across the Arctic. But so at that point I was thinking, okay, like even if like it was felt very exposing to be getting global now media coverage for something you hadn't done and that sounded like a bit of an outrageous, ambition. But the core was we needed to get people talking about swan conservation and sending us in information. And that was already working, even just announcing that I was going to do it. So I had that consolation that if I didn't manage to do it, if we didn't even manage to get off the ground in the first place, then at least we were achieving an outcome just, with that. And it would only be my ego maybe that was a little bit bruised, but we already had achieved something for swans. And so, yeah. Was I going somewhere interesting with that? Was that my point?
No, it was, yeah, I guess in terms of it all, like once you were up in the air and going, I know you said you broke your knee and stuff too, but like how long was this whole undertaking once you were flying?
About 3 months.
Oh
So
God.
yeah, yeah. I mean, 2 months. I'm not flying every day, and with a tank that can fly for 3.5 hours in the Arctic, I actually couldn't fly for more than 2 hours at a time, really, because the batteries that were charging my heated gloves would only last for about 2 hours, and I realized pretty soon that as soon as you get cold in the hands, that cold kind of spreads further. And this was even before the expedition. We did some trials in Sweden on an ice lake, and there I realized at one point, as soon as my hand started to get cold, that your brain stops working as well as it should. And I noted that because I came up to the site that I was going to land in, and conveniently, there was a windsock in the field. Like in most places, you're reading the ripples on the water or the direction all the ducks are facing or smokestacks or something for your wind direction. And I looked at a windsock and I had to ask myself, does the windsock point upwind or downwind? And
Wow.
like that's pretty core to like that should just be muscle memory. That shouldn't require any extra brain power. And so as soon as I realized that, I was like, okay, I'm not doing any flights that are more than a couple of hours, and I need to have the kind of heat in my hands and everything else. Otherwise we're landing straight away.
Yeah, so
Um,
oh go ahead.
yeah. No.
I was gonna say, did you just basically have, ground crews where it's, hey, this 200 miles is your guys' section. You'll kind of follow along and meet her wherever she's landing.
So there was in most places there was another pilot from the country. So across the Arctic there was a Russian pilot and another pilot who was there as kind of cameraman and other. For the first 1,000 kilometers we didn't have a ground crew, but I'd met this amazing bush pilot, a guy called Vlad, who on my first recce trip, and he had offered to, so that was our big challenge across the Arctic, was actually finding where I could get fuel. And I'd embarrassed myself on my first meeting with a load of mostly people from the hunting and hunting tourism fields. And I was engaging them also because we wanted to talk to them about swans eventually, but we were engaging on logistics to start with. So I'd embarrassed myself by asking whether I could get fuel in some towns like I've seen names of along the north coast. And one of them pointed out that there was a word at the end of those town names in brackets, and that meant abandoned. So there were towns that had literally been abandoned 20 years beforehand. So I definitely couldn't get fuel there, but this Vlad guy had stood up and he'd made marks on the map of there's various facilities that aren't visible necessarily on a Google or a Bing map, I think it was even at the time, which was a hunting huts that he would drop people to sometimes, and also weather stations where there'd be one or two people like permanently living on an outpost on their own. He'd offered to leave fuel drops for me at those places, so for me and the other pilots, which was great. So that is how we had fuel drops across the north. And then, yeah, in other places, so in most towns, we could get fuel there, but we did have a ground crew meeting us from Arkhangelsk and from there south. So with a few deviations so through the Tiger Forest, there were areas where didn't realize till we got there that actually I wasn't comfortable following the ground crew along the dirt road. So it was dirt road cut through the trees, because the road isn't quite as wide as it look on the map, and some areas there isn't. Most areas that I've been across Europe and other places, there's, areas of cleared land or deforestation patches everywhere. Some areas that was pretty thick and I couldn't see obvious landing, and the roads were narrow enough. And with paramotoring and paragliding, the real dangerous thing with a landing in trees is actually catching your wingtip. Because if you catch a wingtip on either side, so like you don't want just a few meters either side, you want quite a few either side. If you catch a wingtip, you fall, and impact with the ground will be bad. So I wasn't happy that was wide enough. And certainly when you're going down onto a road strip in between trees, there's turbulence as the air's moving down. And so I was not happy with that. So I opted instead to take a river, a wider river route. And there we sometimes couldn't meet up with the ground crew for quite a long way. So I was relying on landing in small communities where we could get fuel. And at one point I had this fabulous hunter sitting by the river with his boat, overhearing the situation. And he came up and he said, "Look, I've got a satellite phone, follow the river. And if you have any issues whatsoever, just text me and I'll come and find you and bring fuel or come and rescue you if need be." Again, it was people going, "You what? You've got these people following swans." I mean, yeah, I'll be a part of that. So yeah, that was, what was the original question while we were on this again? So you asked about fuel and logistics and how we're getting places. So yeah,
That is just, I mean, again, I'm kind of mesmerized by it all. And I know I'm gonna check the time here because I know I told you I'd try and we're at
see the time.
an hour and
20:05.
okay. Are you good to go for another? I promise I can start bringing this to a close, but are you good to go for
Okay,
another little bit?
Yep.
Okay. Because I want to keep talking to you. I have like a million other questions. I just, I get, it sounds like, so I want to talk about some of the outcomes of this, and then
Yep.
maybe some of the at least get to touch on some of the other stuff that you've done and then what's coming up. I guess you'd already mentioned that, you guys were being well received well before this even started, just with the training. Did you, in your eyes, was it a success in terms of the feedback and the maybe momentum that carried forward into the public and outside of the project?
Yes. So I guess we had multiple outcomes for it. So in terms of media coverage, we needed people in all the different countries to be talking about swans. I think we ended up with 2,000 stories. I think 700 of those were on broadcast, so whether on radio or television along the flyway.
That
sounds like so worse. Just on that level. So that wasn't, I guess, me personally. I guess it was a success. The coverage itself, I don't necessarily see as success, but the fact that it's the fact that there was a public response to that was really important. So across various parts in Russia, so yeah, in Russia, where people said they wouldn't be interested. I think we got 83 pieces of coverage. Some of those were, and at the end, I think I had 3 different TV networks all vying to be like the first on scene at a landing, and that was pretty impressive. We got, on the back of that though, we got members of the public sending in photos and video of swans hitting power lines in different places, and an oil site somewhere where swans were mistaking waste oil pit for a lake, and were landing in that. So yeah, hunters, like wives, sending in pictures of swan heads, saying, "Oh, I keep telling him not to bring home a swan because they're chewy and hard to pluck." Anyway, so we've got all sorts of information. We had then birders were out, birders were out, and as soon as they were basically looking at where the birds were all trapped on a website. So they were going out and finding our birds by their bill pattern in different places and telling us where they were, where there was young, what other disturbance was there. So we were basically crowdsourcing a massive information, which was, that in itself was fantastic. So across the Russian Arctic, we managed to get engaged with all the Nenets communities and the hunters up there, and could paint a much better picture of who are these hunters, like who are they that might be shooting swans up here. It was also happening in other countries. But on the back of that, the hunters themselves created something called the Swan Champion Network. And they, yeah, in a meeting, we had one stand up and in very fast Russian, which sounded angry, turn to all the others for 5 minutes. And at the time I was thinking, God, I'm not quite following whether this is he angry or what. And he was basically telling them all like, we should be dealing with this. Like, it's ridiculous, leaving some others to do with it. We know what's happening. We know how we can get the posters out to people. We had the Russian hunting. We ended up with a conference actually in Arkhangelsk, and an academic up there said to all of his colleagues, "Isn't it embarrassing that it took an Australian British lady flying a little paramotor to get us to talk to each other?" And on the back of that, there was a journalist from the Times who was attended that, and he kept on. He was at all of our meetings there, and he kept on at the hunting inspectorate in Moscow until they sent information out with 50,000 hunting licenses, explaining actually like why about the different swan species and basically a lot of them said, we don't believe that you can actually count them, so are they really in decline? So that basically outlined the different swan species and how we know and why we know. So that was really useful. We identified a few power lines en route, a particular one in Estonia, which was killing hundreds of swans every year, but a lot more of everything else. It was just built really badly, 6 lines high. And the locals had been watching swans hit the power line on migration every year and had been told it's too expensive. We just need power to the island. And we managed to come through and say, actually, the numbers you're killing here are enough to be pushing a species to extinction. And within a year, they had taken down half the power lines and put diverters on the rest. And then they managed to raise the funds. And at one point, they said by 2028, they would hope to have buried the lines. And they did it last year. And 3 months earlier, because the engineers found out that migration was in October and they had the funds. So why don't we just do it? So all those power lines have been buried. I could go on. We managed in a few places, and in one site it was paramotorists that actually didn't realize nothing was marked on their flying maps, but they were disturbing birds at one of their critical sites en route. So they ended up with they did some tests and ended up with a written agreement. Some things that say happen really quickly, where people responded straight away with some information, or a load of fish farms that had taken over all of the wetlands in a particular country. Contacted us and said, gosh, we had no idea. We use the wetland for fish farms, but we didn't realize that the birds actually need the wetlands just to rest, as resting spots as well. Yeah. Drain them a week before the migration time, but we could drain them 3 months later if that would help. So that was an instant win. The power line, that took 6 years to get, or 1 year to get the first reduction and 6 years to get other. So I could go on, but I feel like I'm just reading out a series of facts to you. But yeah. Everywhere that we had impact was somewhere where we could tell a story that says, this is actually about the swans. It's not about a conservation agenda. It's not attacking hunting. Like, we need help. Like, what can you do? And we allowed everybody to see themselves as the hero. And we thanked people for it. We made point of going back to Estonia and thanking the power company for it was a massive effort they had to do, but it's the impact is huge.
Well, I'd never heard of the power lines being an issue until I started researching you. I've known, so oil pits are actually a big issue here in the States, and so are the wind turbine farms. I'm sure you've probably seen pictures of the wind turbine farms in the state. I mean, they're ridiculous. And my dad actually, after he got out of the military, he worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a federal law enforcement agency for wildlife stuff. And when we lived in Oklahoma for a couple of years, and that was like a lot of the cases he was working was these migratory birds in these open oil pits landing there dying. And it's just
really,
but the power lines thing is interesting. Is it basically just the fact that it's clotheslining birds because they don't see they're there, so they're flying into them at full speed?
They are flying into them at full speed, quite often. So this was a really interesting thing, and this was where I was really able to help by flying with the birds. I had, essentially, I'm taking a European context. Okay, so in this, the birds don't see them, and so I had various different farmers and other people that take a very pragmatic view of kind of nature and wildlife and land management, who said, Well, surely it'll be, it's a bit, this is a kind of evolution, like the dumb birds that don't look out for power lines will die,
Yeah.
and only the smart ones will survive and they won't hit them anymore. But actually, when you're flying at a bird's kind of altitude, looking down on a power line, it's dark. So against a dark background, you can't see them. But further than that, your eyes are focused on the landscape behind you. So you also don't focus on something mid-air. So as a pilot myself, you don't see them. We are mapping between two pylons. You're visually making making the connection.
Yeah.
But also in autumn, when there's quite often low cloud cover, there tend to be in this lower level band where the power lines are. Some that aren't built, that are built badly, are built so there's multiple tiers of power lines. So this in Estonia, where I said there was 6 tiers. So anyway, if they do manage to like just sort of touch a power line, and they can potentially divert. If in this case, if they divert, they hit another power line. If they divert from that, they hit into the power line. So that was just, it was just really bad construction on every level if you're taking wildlife into account. But not only that, where we have removed across the Europe, so many wetlands have been drained to make farmland. There are very few left. And where there are not very many wetlands left anymore, the birds, and from about the 70s, they haven't been able to feed completely in the wetlands on wetland vegetation, because they're also quite, manufactured and tidied wetlands that are there. So they're having to feed on waste crops out on farmland, which means that they're going to the water to be safe from predators at night. But early in the morning, so at dawn and dusk, in low light, they are flying out from the wetlands out to find farm fields, which is taking them again in the territory where there's farms and people and power lines. So we're actually created a situation where they are by default, basically where there's less and less wetlands, more and more human infrastructure, they are more likely to collide with them. And adding to that, the lead poisoning from eating lead pellets. When we get the corpses of birds which have hit power lines, they're more likely than an average swan to have a high level of lead in their body as well. So to have been, be partly poisoned by lead. So there's power lines. Let's say power lines are a nexus for wildlife, but it's made much worse when there's all these other factors behind them.
Yeah, that's
But
a lot of
yeah.
cards stacked against them. That's a very dynamic issue that you just don't think about.
But the nice thing is the diverters. If you use the right sort of diverters, that does make them very visible. You really need the public to let you know where that's happening. Like if there's a swan that's hit a power line somewhere, there's probably other swans will hit it as well. And if the power company can be, reminded and asked to get out there and put diverters on the lines, big visible things on them, do prevent the collisions.
Are those the things that look like buoys that you see on power lines sometimes?
Sometimes they tend to be the high level, really high capacity lines, but there's others which are spinners, which spin and have fluorescent and reflective sheets on the other side. So in the wind, they make, even in low light, they'll make a noise which will be disturbing by spinning, and they'll flash in different lights. And so even in really low light and even at night, birds would still know if there was a wind that there's something there. So there are different designs for different situations and vast amounts of guidelines for that. But most companies will only put them on if they know that their power lines are going through like a migration corridor.
Yeah, learn something every day. I've seen those before and been like, what? I just assumed it was an added thing like to the lights that we already put on the posts, but that's interesting. Okay. Well, and I know that ended up taking you did another flight with the ospreys to freaking Africa. Like, and did that all spin out of what you saw during the flight of the swans?
Yeah, so the osprey and was also a continuation of the flyway. So that the flyway that the swans do from the Arctic down into the UK, and lots of other birds do that. I didn't mention that before. The reason I'd agreed to put so much effort into the swans was that lots of other species that are much less visible and much less well loved are doing the same migration route. But that migration route carries down into down into West Africa, down into Southern Africa. And so, yeah, I was keen to follow the osprey. And the osprey for in the US is not a species you have to worry about, but in the UK and many countries across Europe, it was persecuted to extinction in most countries. So out of extinct in the UK and any Catholic countries because of building fish farms. So because people didn't eat fish on a Friday. So most Catholic countries across Europe, they were extinct in. And so they are trying to make a comeback now. But the juvenile birds that head off on migration from the UK, 70% never come back. And so yeah, that was
Wow.
yeah, another expedition to try and figure out who and what and why. And again, what I was saying about the Swan expedition was most areas where we had impact, it was where we actually found someone locally who already had an idea of what was going on, perhaps didn't know quite how big an issue it was, and they needed some added profile or support or something else. So in most areas, locals already had an idea of what might be a problem. Maybe they didn't know what to do about it. But that is a big part of it, is getting outside of the normal circles of conservation and sourcing ideas and knowledge from different people. But yeah, in a very different context down into West Africa.
Yeah, I love it. It's momentum carrying forward, and it's cool. You've kind of found your, I mean, like you talked about, like you've learned the strategies, and you've almost like found your lane with all this. What's coming next?
So the next I'm struggling with a little bit. It was so I was made UN ambassador for migratory birds after the Swan project, and the guy who was running one of the departments called me up a couple of years ago, and he said he had terminal cancer, and I said to him, "God, is there anything I can do at all?" And he was like, "No, I've had a good innings, but please do something for the vultures." And at the time, I was pretty ignorant to actually the different challenges for vultures around the world. But I'd flown with them in a paraglider, which you can do, in the US and in various places across Europe. They're most amazing birds to fly with. They help you, but they also come and fly with you.
Really?
Yeah, and so they're really, really impressive for the air, but I had no idea of the different challenges they were facing around the world. So anyway, for him, I agreed to take it on, and I think hopefully you've got the idea that whilst lots of people said, don't do the vultures. You're like the other species you worked on are already well loved, and this is like you're
They're
coming for the other
ugly.
end.
Yeah.
You're coming for the other end with vultures. And but yeah, I hope you've got the picture that I'm not put off by things that seem to be difficult. And I just saw a really powerful story in the vultures, and a particular most of the threats. So there's lots of different species around the world. Many of them are in really serious decline. In India, we'd lost 99% of some of the birds. Like, it's really drastic. And yet there are very few species around the world that you can so easily put an economic value on what they give to people. So it's saving us from,
Wow.
when things kind of rot, disease runs rife, people die. It costs India, is it 50 billion a year or something? It's a vast amount of money because of the spread of diseases from rabies and dogs and things without the vultures in place. So there's a very clear economic case, and most of the threats to the vultures have some connection to our global industries and supply chains. And so I feel like this is a different kind of story, not the kind of migrations that go in a continuous route. Vultures are considered migratory because they can do 5 countries in a day just cruising for food. And I am completely sure that we can do something for them. And part of that is just around public perception, because we don't act fast enough because we don't like them. And I know public perception can be changed because I see and hear about vultures, and the picture I have is of the most epic aerial aviator ever, really impressive in the air. But also, if I say to people, we've got to do something to protect the vultures, and they kind of wince a little bit, even if they like nature. But if you say we've got to protect the condors and other things like them, and people are like, oh, yeah. And so someone has managed to rebrand the condor as one of the vulture species, in a way. And I know in North America, sometimes tourists will go, yeah, we've seen condors, and they've actually
Yeah.
seen turkey vultures or black vultures or something else, and you just don't bother to correct them because people Yeah, the condors are have already had the rebrand somewhere along the line, and so I'm pretty sure we can do that for the other incredible species. It just might be a long journey. However, I tend to focus on the corporate funding, and there's definitely a challenge getting a brand to want to put their name next to the word vulture.
Vulture. Yeah.
As you've got vulture banking and vulture accounting, and nearly always the references is not a good one. But yeah, I've said I'll do something to try and work with them, and their stories are fascinating. So let's start with telling their stories.
I feel like you need to, that would be like Vulture would look fine next to like a cage fighting organization or like some sort of martial arts thing. You need to go down a different lane.
It's the unexpected heroes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you've got any ideas, if any of your listeners have got any ideas, that would be fantastic. There's actually a cultural magazine, right, called Vulture that would be amazing to have as a partner in this. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is one of the few people I could imagine in the whole world that could have brought in the legislation in California, getting rid of lead ammunition, which meant the condors could start making a comeback. So Arnold Schwarzenegger on side would be great as well. So if you've got anyone who knows Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Believe it or not, I have not had Arnold on the show yet. So
haven't you?
love to.
Binds two-pronged effort.
Yeah, yeah. We'll get him on the show and then get him on board with the flight and maybe get him to make a cameo and a, extra large paramotor.
He can be the hero of my film, but yeah.
Yeah, it's so cool. I'm like, so how can people find you? How can people get involved if someone does want to put their name next to Vulture? Like what can people do to help you out?
So find me on Conservation Without Borders. That would be amazing. At the moment, we are also, this is a bit of a or Sacha Dench, but I tend to be more active with Conservation Without Borders. And we are actually at the moment, we are as part of the IUCN action plan for the swans. We are offering the Flight of the Swans film, so an hour-long film has been made of it, screenings around the world. So basically all of the, most of the issues that are affecting the swans are affecting other birds in other areas. So we basically want people to take inspiration from the swans, but also the people included in the film. So if anybody is interested in hosting a screening, that can be done at the moment. Again, you can contact me, Sacha Dench, SACHA, or Conservation Without Borders. And there's a really simple form to request that as well. So yeah, that'll do for now. Otherwise, I absolutely love speaking to different audiences. So even if you don't want to have vultures next to your brand, if you've got platforms or audiences that I can speak to and inspire, we might reach people through that means as well.
Awesome. I honestly feel like I could talk to you for 3 hours. I'm just trying to be respectful of your time here because I think I told you it would be an hour and a half probably.
Well, next time, I desperately would love to come back and talk vultures and all sorts of other things. So yeah.
Let's stay in touch for sure because this is great. You're super, super easy to talk to. This is it's fascinating. So thank you again.
And can I say thank you for such a thoughtful podcast? I've done quite a few, and actually ones which really make me think and delve a little deeper into the who and the wow and what people can learn from it. It has been really interesting, and more than the kind of the superficial how and the flying and the superhero bit.
Oh,
thanks for bringing a very human element to it.
So I'm glad it comes across that I'm genuinely interested, not being like out of the can questions that everybody asks. But thank you again. This was just awesome, and you have huge balls doing all this. So it's so cool. And I hope you're proud of what you're doing.
So. Thank you.
Thanks everyone at home for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. Again, I say this every week, but this is a conversation that needs to be heard. So share it around with another curious mind who needs to hear it. And if you've been listening for a while and you enjoy these things, take a second to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Or if you're one of the people who's jumped on the bandwagon and is watching these now on YouTube, subscribe to the channel there so you get notified about all the new episodes that come out each week. And with all that out of the way, I will see you next time. Bye.